IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today we're going to talk about parenting young tennis players. It's a topic that Josh and I haven't covered yet, although we have perhaps alluded to some parenting and junior tennis themes in many of our episodes. But we wanted to spend an episode dedicated to parenting your child or parenting your player through competition phases as maybe they start young, whether that be 6 or 7, and then traversing all the way to 17, 18, and hopefully even beyond that. It's an important topic. It's one that there's a lot of research on in terms of how to be a great parent, how to help your player develop through the sport. And we have organized today's discussion essentially into 3 sections. First, we're going to talk about understanding the purpose of having your child play a sport like tennis. And I think some of that could also apply to some other sports as well. I think that's something we'll cover. Secondly, we'll discuss the challenges that you as a parent will face in the environment and specific to tennis. And then we'll get into some good practices for you to think about as a tennis parent and really almost as a performer in this context. And then lastly, we'll just refer to some resources that could be very helpful on your journey. There's a lot of good stuff out there now from various tennis associations on development models, etc., that could be very useful for you as a tennis parent. So, Josh, let's begin with purpose. And we were discussing this prior to recording, that understanding your purpose or your mission for getting your child or player involved in a sport like tennis is very important because it sets the foundation, or at least it could be some guiding principles in terms of what you want for your child, how you'll conduct your own self in that process, etc. And so, I figured let's start there because I don't think a lot of programs or even webinars get parents to think about this question. The question of why. Starting with why. Anybody who's familiar with Simon Sinek may have read that book. I think it applies to many different contexts, and that's certainly a question that we can begin with here is, okay, why get your child involved in a sport like tennis?
Yeah, I would agree that that's a good starting point. And I think the reason why is because once that is clearly defined, once a parent has that clear definition for why it is beneficial to have their child involved in sports, a lot of the decisions and behaviors that go along with it, which we'll discuss in this episode, become a lot clearer. And there really are a lot of benefits to taking part in sports in general, and then specifically in a sport like tennis. Number one is that it's fun, and we've seen through the research that a vast majority of kids who quit sports, I think it's 70% of kids who quit sports by age 13 quit it because they're not enjoying it, because they're not having fun. It's not because they're not winning enough. It's not, generally because of an injury. It's because they're not having fun. They're not enjoying it. So, promoting the sport as something fun to do, as something enjoyable, ought to be ought to be the priority, or at least one of the priorities. And within that, within the fact that it's fun, it's something active. It keeps somebody fit. It's something that you can play with friends. So I think that the fun aspect should be definitely something that's mentioned and prioritized. And often, and I think we've talked about this on the show, a lot of junior tennis players, and I think adult tennis players as well, get into the sport and start playing because they enjoy it, because it's fun. However, at a certain point, it often starts to change. It becomes more about winning. It starts to become more about rankings and ratings and rivalries. but to remember that fun should still be you know prioritized and remembered is as I think really critical when we think about why it's beneficial for parents to encourage their children to play sports and specifically to play tennis.
Yeah, and the fun, it shouldn't actually stop just because you're growing into an adult. Tennis ought to be fun for adults too. It ought to be fun for professional players, and maybe what's fun about it transitions over time. But you mentioned a few of those challenges. But if we go back to the topic of being competitive, there's a fun aspect of being competitive, right? It's that the act of competing, playing the game, the struggle in a way that's enjoyable. If we can even transition fun factors for kids in sport, which are a lot, being with our friends, maybe even when we're first getting started, we're playing with our parents, or our parents are praising us for good behavior, good sporting behavior. That's a fun factor. And in fact, if people are interested in more in fun factors in youth sport, there's a professor at George Washington University, I believe, Amanda Visek, Visek. She has a lot of material about fun integration factors going into youth sport, not necessarily for tennis, but you can look at that and just see what kids find fun and emphasize more of that in how you deal with your child and maybe even their program. Um, but we want to make sure that it stays fun because, like you said, Josh, it can become about different things. But if we can transition fun into being enjoying competing, enjoying playing the game, even though it's hard, yeah, as we get older. So the fun piece, I think, is so important because you talked about that age in which kids quit by 13. That's, I guess the tragedy of that is you really haven't gotten yourself to a physical maturity place where you could actually make a decision about competently specializing in a sport like tennis. Um, at 15, 16, you're in a better position to make that decision. And if you can't even get there because for some reason the sport has become not fun for you, that's sad. And that's not why we want people to leave a sport like tennis. We want them to continue to engage, and so I think that's one of the things that we want to make sure parents understand is it's we want to help players get to a specific get play long term, and that should I think be one of our goals here. One of the purposes and why we introduce a sport like tennis is we are introducing a sport for life. This is something that not only do you want to play throughout your childhood and maybe into your early adult years, it'd be great if you could play all through your life and compete there. I think it's also a sport, along with playing other sports, that introduces the concept of physical literacy, meaning you know how to move. It's active. You learn certain footwork patterns. You develop hand-eye coordination. And again, other sports can help with that too, and they help to complete a full picture of that. So we want to make sure that tennis is that's one of the reasons we're doing it is it's helping develop that physical literacy. And I think maybe the last part I'll talk on, Josh, and we can get into more of this and some specifics is tennis can be a very good vehicle for teaching good character and life lessons. And I know we've mentioned in the past that tennis by itself does not build character. It's the environment in which tennis is taught that does that, right? So that's really the coaches and the parents. So if coaches and parents have a good sense of how to develop character, how to teach life lessons through a sport like tennis, then that's a great reason to get someone involved. So perhaps what we can do now, Josh, talk about some of the things that tennis can do, like some of the character building things or the life lessons that tennis can help build.
Yeah, absolutely. And There are many. I think one that I would start with is learning to win and learning to lose. Not that every tennis player competes, not that every tennis player needs to necessarily, but as a competitor, especially in an individual sport, you will go through the winning and losing, and I think it's different from a team sport in that it all falls on you.
Yeah.
Sure, in doubles, there's another player on the court, but or on your side of the court, but it all falls on you. So learning how to win with dignity, with grace, with treating your opponents with respect, but also learning to lose, to take ownership over what happened, what you could have done better, to maintain your sportsmanship throughout that process as well. So I think that is one key element in terms of learning how to win and lose in a effective way with sportsmanship, with maintaining some of these um, character traits. I think also learning from our experiences, learning from these matches, learning from both practice, both matches. We talk a lot about learning from defeat, but also learning what went well. So I think just being able to reflect and learn from that process is a big one. But I think maybe even more importantly than some of these, you learn a lot about hard work, about what it takes to develop yourself, to improve. You learn about responsibility and taking ownership. I mean, in a sport like tennis, if you're not willing to put in the hours, if you're not willing to take responsibility for what happened on a given day, and why the result was the way it was, it's essentially impossible to continue improving. So I think these are among the some of the characteristics that are built in a sport like tennis.
Yeah, and so continuing on the responsibility ownership piece, and I think that's something that develops more and more as the player gets older. So we often talk about, especially in coaching models, moving from, say, an athlete-centered approach when players are younger and having them begin to transition to an athlete ownership model where they can take more responsibility for their training. They may drive themselves to tournaments. They may set up their own practice sessions with, peers or practice partners, where parents are a little less involved in that. Um, and so that's important to be teaching that players are, going from this, all right, everything's about me, and then it's all transitioning to owning this whole process. And that develops something that we call, autonomy, which is a very important part of our own motivation to do anything. We hate to feel controlled, especially as we get older. We don't want people telling us what to do all the time and that we're just doing it. Although I think maybe some people get very comfortable with that if that's how they've always grown up. But tennis is a really hard sport if people have always been solving your problems. And so responsibility and ownership is something that a sport like tennis can really help you develop, but we have to be conscious of it as coaches and parents. You mentioned the idea, Josh, of reflecting on experiences. We want to make sure that players can do that process on their own and maybe do it before they get the input of a parent or a coach at a certain point. So that they're developing their own coaching voice, they're developing their tennis IQ as they go along. So there's a lot that can be learned in terms of responsibility, ownership, and having some autonomy, feeling like you have control over your life or your tennis career. I think this is also an opportunity getting your child into a sport like tennis or any sport. It's an opportunity to put them in something, I guess, a pursuit of mastery. And that's another basic psychological need that we all have from a motivational perspective. And I think one of the challenges with that, Josh, is there's such emphasis, as you said, with winning and rankings, and less on the mastery side. of things. There's a part of me that thinks it would be great if we could come up with some system in tennis that would be similar to like martial arts, where we could be, having like a black belt of competitiveness, where it's not so much about winning and rankings, although that might be part of it, but maybe it's hours of dedication and other behaviors, so that we could be aspiring to not just be, accumulating wins, but a certain way of being. Now that's a very pie in the sky type of thing that I've often thought about, but that is in essence the journey that you're putting your child on is can they become a master competitor? Can they become a black belt competitor in the sport of tennis? Um, and that's a journey that is a long one. It's not just about getting into college and playing on a college tennis team. That might be a milestone on that journey. But knowing that we all have this psychological need to feel competent, to feel like we're good at something, tennis is an opportunity to help satisfy that basic psychological need in your player. I would say it's an arena in which they can practice the skill of being a master at something and learning to be competent at it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think tennis gives people the opportunity and almost forces people to make a lot of these choices. Um, what is your playing style going to be? What type of tournaments you're going to play in? What who's your coach going to be, or what is your training going to look like? And I think ideally parent through parents trying to teach their kids these lessons of autonomy, of being able to make their own decisions and take ownership. Um, it it really does, it really can teach a lot of these skills that we're talking about. So I think I'm really glad that you brought up that point. Um, I think when we talk about things to avoid, which would be more on the side of parents making all the decisions, or maybe trying to live out unfulfilled hopes or dreams. Sometimes I think it crosses over to parents say, okay, this is the way that you need to play. These are the tournaments that need to be played, or just starting to make all of those decisions for somebody. But when we think about, again, going back to the research and think about motivation and self-determination theory, autonomy is a huge piece of that. Being able to make one's own decisions is going to help players, enjoy that process more, and ultimately stick around the sport a lot longer. We talk about burnout and dropout, and people leaving the sport maybe prematurely. We mentioned, that age of 13, really, where before somebody's gotten to the point of physical maturity, and maybe leaving the sport before they've really seen how much they can accomplish or what level they can ultimately play at. So I think the autonomy is a big piece there, and um, allowing a child to make some of those decisions, not necessarily that they're going to be making every decision for themselves, especially as they're younger. Especially if a parent has experience with the sport, they may want to help guide some of the decisions, and I think that makes a lot of sense. However, as somebody gets older and older and more experienced and more knowledgeable about the game, starting to have them make more and more decisions about their development can be really beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as long as we have that transition in mind and a plan to have the player take more responsibility and ownership over time, yeah, that can work out very well. I think some of the other things that tennis does in terms of building that character and teaching life lessons. You mentioned that dealing with winning and losing, which is great. That's just a great life lesson right there because not everything will go your way. And players who are perhaps sheltered a little too much or have parents who are a little too protective will struggle with that in a sport like tennis. It will expose that. And so, there's probably some level of toughness that needs to be trained with respect to, the learning and winning and losing. But I think, we're also talking about tennis helping with focus and concentration. That will improve over time. Goal setting, being knowing what it means to be competitive, learning to solve problems, understanding rules of the game, learning to be fair and ethical, developing respect not only for yourself but for your opponents, for coaches, for parents, for facilities. There are a lot of opportunities here to develop a person of good character. And this makes me think, Josh, back to our very early episode with Brian Barker, who talked about his parents' emphasis on being a good person and the positive impact of that purpose was that Brian could go onto the court and play with a lot less pressure than many of his peers because being a good person was very controllable for him. He understood, or was taught how to do that. And the winning and the losing, it didn't matter. So he wasn't evaluated on that. And that just freed him up to play some great tennis. So I think there's a lot of goodness in that. And that may be an episode for people who are listening to this one to go back to. And if you don't know Brian's story, definitely go back to that. Great player, great coach, and still a great coach today. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities here to help build a great functioning human being, which is probably one of the major missions of parenting in itself. And tennis can help with that. But you certainly want when your child graduates from high school or college that you've done a good job of raising someone that can independently function in the world and is a good person. And tennis can be part of that. But of course, as you alluded to a little bit earlier, Josh, and maybe we'll cover a little bit more directly now, there are some challenges that go along with that.
Absolutely. And I think I would say one of the biggest ones is too much of a priority or too much of an emphasis on winning and losing, which is connected to, of course, rankings and UTR and ratings and that sort of thing. And I think really where that stems from is being a little bit short-sighted in terms of feeling like any one particular match is sort of the end all be all, is maybe more important than it actually is, rather than prioritizing the development process and prioritizing that over time we're trying to, you know, develop as a player, improve, and again, learn these valuable life lessons and characters, character traits. As you were saying, Brian, the one of the big goals here, maybe the most important goal, is to develop as a person. So, the percentage of tennis players, of junior tennis players that will be professional players and make an income, make a living as a professional player is extremely slim. Furthermore, the percentage of junior players that will go on to get, let's say, a college scholarship is also pretty small. So not making it all about that necessarily, not to say not to have, big goals and not to pursue ambitious things. However, not defining success based on those things, but rather, what type of person is the child becoming, in terms of, um, what does their sportsmanship look like? How do they treat their opponents? How do they treat the people that they're training with on a daily basis? Their coaches? Are they making, line calls in a way that is sportsmanlike? Um, are they working, hard? Are they dealing with those ups and downs of competition in a way that will suit them well later in life when again there will always be ups and downs. Um, so there's that philosophy of prioritizing some of these things, um, sort of compared to the attitude of getting, I would say, too caught up in the individual losses and wins. That it can be easy for an athlete to do, and it can also be easy for a parent to fall into that trap, I would say. Um, so I think that when it comes to challenges, and we'll discuss some others, but when I think of the challenges, I would say that would be probably the first one that would come to mind, just in terms of, you know, we talk about tennis being a sport of instant feedback within a match, right? You either won it, you either after every point you've either won it or you've lost it. And it's the same after a match, right? You've either won the match or you've lost it. You've either moved on in the tournament or you haven't. Your UTR has risen or it's gone down, and it can be very easy to focus on those sorts of things because there's that instant feedback. It can be very quantitative as well. Um, but I think if you could take a step back and remember what the goals are, remember the purpose as well of what are we trying to do here? We're trying to help players, develop skills in a sport for life, right? People can play tennis up till 80s, 90s, beyond. I mean, I've remember playing with a player, in his mid 80s on a weekly basis. So it really is a lifelong sport. It really is a sport that has this um, potential to develop character skills in a really powerful way. It's also a sport that obviously has a lot of physical benefits. So I think keeping some of those things in mind and not getting too caught up in the ups and downs that are inevitable, not getting too caught up in the individual wins and losses, but rather focusing on that development process as a whole, um, is probably one of the biggest challenges.
And just to emphasize, what you were saying there at the end, and that's why we began with the whole purpose piece, right? As a means of helping one through these different challenges. Because you're right, it's very easy to get caught up in that. I think along with that, Josh, we've also had over the years different stories of great athletes who have gone through maybe this model of early specialization. And we also, so like Tiger Woods comes to mind as a golfer, and his journey, um, and how his dad worked with him and all this stuff that they used to do. Um, there's also been the 10,000 hour rule, which is really a simplification and a reduction of a much more complex theory of gaining expertise. But people hear the 10,000 hour rule, and now we're trying to get 10,000 hours in as fast as we can. And does that even make sense given the age or where your child is developmentally? And one of the things I think is a challenge here is that we are all individually different. And how one player physically matures is not going to be exactly the same as another. So what's right for one player may not be right for the other. Um, one of the players I work with, he's 18. He looks physically like he's 24. That's, that's been his path. There's another 18-year-old kid that I know. He looks like he's 14. Skinny, not that tall, probably weighs like 125 pounds. He's an amazing tennis player, but he hasn't fully matured like this other kid who's, probably 5'11", 6 foot, a good, close to 200 pounds, really solid. So we are all different. And so using models that maybe worked for one player may not be appropriate for your player, right? So it's really important to keep that individuality in mind, because it's very easy to compare yourself to others, especially in your region. And somebody you mentioned earlier, rivalries, Josh. That's certainly a challenge for players, especially for those who are in maybe in a region in which there aren't a ton of players. You're going to end up playing the same people all the time. But if all of a sudden you as a parent see one of your players' rivals, they get a big jump in how they're playing, you may be like, oh, what are they doing? Who are they seeing? Who is working with them? And confusing what's going on with them with what should be happening with your own player. We all have our own path. Um, and the more that we can understand that and make the right decisions for our player versus what somebody else is doing, I think the better for your player. Um, so I think that might be something to keep in mind as we try to deal with this winning and losing and overall comparison. Um, I would say, another perhaps thing to talk about, Josh, in terms of challenges, and this is really whether you're at an early stage or maybe around that 12, 13 piece is when should we think about specializing in a sport like tennis? Because again, there are some outliers here in terms of specialization. I think the research would say, in general, you should expose yourself to a lot of different sports up until age 13, 14. And the reason for that is because other sports will teach you different neurological skills and different physical skills that one sport won't cover. So, for example, if you've got a tennis player who also plays soccer, well, in soccer, they may be developing a different kind of scanning ability visually. They may be developing excellent footwork that might not get developed if they just play tennis. Um, so we want to think about that, and then there's an age of transition. But when I think of an outlier, Jared Donaldson, the American player who's been injured, and to be honest, Josh, I don't even know what's happening with his career at this point. But he's been away from the game for a while. But his coach is local to me here in New England, and he's talked about how Jared did not play any other sports. Really, from age 7, it was tennis only. Um, and so we don't want to necessarily latch on to that as, oh, well, that's the way to do it. There are always going to be outliers. But if you want to base your own child's development on outliers, in some ways that can make sense because we do want to study people who are exceptional and have reached a high level. But and I think they did a study, Josh, and Eric Buderak may have referred to this at some point in one of his talks. They did a study of the top 50 or top 100 ATP players at one point. Not a single one specialized in tennis before age 13. Every single one of them played another sport. Rafael Nadal is famous for talking about how he played soccer as a kid. Many
at a high
European
level.
kids. Yeah, at a very high
Yeah.
level. Right. And so, when to specialize in tennis, I just want to get your kind of thoughts on that. When do you think that that's a good time to do?
Yeah, I think you've pinpointed that, that 12 to 14 time period where it can be, generally if a player has started playing tournaments at a younger age, they've at least had a few years of tournament experience at that point. Not always, but you at least have some sort of a sample size, maybe from a couple different sports, which sport it might make most sense to specialize in. Where if somebody starts out playing, you know, let's say 2, 3, 4 different sports, you have maybe enough data and physically, somebody is more developed at that point rather than choosing to specialize, let's say at age 9 or 10. And yeah, you mentioned Rafael Nadal, who, I played a lot of soccer growing up. His uncle being a professional player, and I've heard him talking about having to make that decision. And I know Djokovic. I believe his father was a ski jumper. I believe, and I know he's talked about skiing throughout his life, even writing that in I believe contracts with agents. I believe that it was an essential part of that. He was going to continue doing that despite any sort of risk of injuries. And I think in general, as you mentioned, through playing different sports growing up, you develop a lot of things, both neurologically and physically, whether it be balance, whether it be ball tracking, a sport like baseball, if you're, you know, a batter, being able to track and watch a ball, a baseball coming towards you and track it enough to make good contact and
Yeah,
get a
same with
hit
cricket,
is
right? So for those of
absolutely
us in other countries, yeah,
I mean, it's the skill set there is very easy to apply to tennis. Or it's very connected rather. So I think in any of these sports, I mean, even in football, right? There are these stories of wide receivers who have experience with ballet, right? Just in terms of the footwork, in terms of getting their feet in bounds for a catch. So um, as much as it may seem like at age 9, 10, 11, 12, it's a race to get to those 10,000 hours to become a master at that age. It's not. I actually, it's yes, obviously you want to be getting that experience. You want to be playing matches. You want to be developing your game. I saw a great tweet recently. Maybe I've mentioned this. I don't think I have. And I think it's actually very connected to the conversation we're having, where maybe I can actually pull it up. But essentially, somebody tweeted a photo of their child um, after a loss, and the child was clearly distraught, clearly upset, and tagged a few professional players. And Taylor Fritz, who I believe had just won Indian Wells at the time, the Masters tournament, responded and said something along the lines of, um, at that age, focus on having fun, focus on developing your game. Results or individual results don't matter so much. That prioritize some of these other things like we're talking about, the fun aspect, the developing your game aspect, sort of lose sight of some of these individual wins and losses. I don't think most adults are defined by wins and losses that took place at age 12 or age 13. Do some people look back to their high school or college or 16s or 18s matches? Sure. But remember, keeping some of these things in mind and remembering that you have a long path ahead of you, um, and knowing that the detrimental effects of placing too much emphasis on any individual match, just keeping some of these things in mind can, I think, save some of these kids from dropping out or from leaving the sport earlier before they really see what they could do.
yeah. I mean, that's a great bit of advice from Taylor Fritz there. Because as we've been saying, it's bigger than that. It's more about you developing yourself as a player, developing your skills, developing yourself as a person. All of those are in control. Those are, there are controllable behaviors that will help you with that. Winning is not in our control. Do we have some influence over our ability to perform? Yes, but not 100%. And, if you're the number one 12-year-old in the world or 14-year-old in the world, nobody really cares. And that is not at all indicative of future success. I've often told the story of, I won't name the name, but the player who was number one in the world when I was in the 14s. He turned out to be a great player, but he never really did anything that anybody would have heard of on the pro tour. Great college player, um, but never a top 100 professional. So this emphasis on being great so early on, it doesn't have any correlation to future success as a player. And so when we talk about the idea of specializing, maybe we begin to entertain those thoughts at 13, 14. Um, but there was a study done in Sweden in the late 80s. And for those of the listeners who are my age or older, would remember that Swedish tennis in the 1980s was really good. Bjorn Borg and his success really spurred a lot of other young players, Stefan Edberg, Mats Wilander, and several Anders Jarred, and several others. And the Swedes were awesome. And even David Samuel talked about that in his Locker Room Power episode with us. And so they did a study in Sweden on players who had made it, sort of made it, quote unquote, made it, versus others who were maybe just the next level down. And it was a really interesting contrast in that the ones who had gone on to success at the pro level actually specialized later in tennis than the other ones just below them. And for them, the age of specialization was a little bit later than what we're talking about. It was more 15, 16. So they had kept themselves in the game up until that age, right? They kept fun as a central component of why they played. But then they had more maturity at 15, 16 to make that decision to commit to training, to be more professional in what they did. And then that helped them, go through those early years, 16, 17, 18 on the tour and developing into excellent players. Where the ones who had specialized a little bit earlier, the fun piece wasn't there as much for them. They weren't able to translate it into the same sort of success that the ones who specialize later. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about when do we start to have those discussions? 13, 14, 15, 16. It's really also going to depend on your player. How mature is your player versus others? Um, how are we doing in terms of developing skills like independence, reliance, ownership, etc.? If they don't have some of that at 13 or 14, then that's not the right age to all of a sudden start specializing in it. Maybe they need to further develop some specific skills before they can really competently make that decision. But I think the overall message here is specialization in general should occur later, and there should be multi-sport participation, sampling, for, as you mentioned, Josh, different ways of growing neurologically, physically, etc. Because that's all going to be really important in terms of creating this great tennis competitor, hopefully in your mid to late teens.
Absolutely. And I think, team sports, right? If somebody's playing in a team sport, and again, we talked about dealing dealing with winning and losing, which every athlete has to deal with. If you're in a team sport, you may get different perspectives from some of your coaches, from some of your teammates. Maybe there's great role models on your team, whether it's captains, whether it's other teammates, and you can learn a lot from them about how to handle these situations. Again, you may also be influenced in a negative way because, again, as we've talked about, sport is not inherently something that builds character. It can be positive or negative, right? And depending on the circumstances. But there can certainly be positive role models that you're around, that see things in a different way and can help to encourage that development. So I think that's huge. Do we want to maybe, as we get to this third section, why don't we start to think about some best practices for parents, and then we can finish with a few resources that we'll link to in the show notes in the description, so people can check out those links and have access to those resources. But first, when we talk about these best practices, and I think at least some of these we've covered at least partially in the first couple sections in terms of the purpose piece and the challenges piece. I think one of the biggest ones for me would be just unconditional support and love, right? Regardless of performance, where just knowing that performance, as we've talked about, there will always be those ups and downs, but I would say a best practice to start with is, not having the child ever wonder, are they being supportive or are they being loved based on how they're doing, based on how they're performing, based on, whether things are going well for them or not going well for them on the court. So I think that would be one that I would start with. Another thing that I would add, and this is more of a specific tactic, is when a parent is watching a match, and I think there's a lot we can say here, both in terms of what we've seen, and the research, but remembering that they're a performer too, and remembering that they want to be leading by example, where it's going to be tough for a parent to encourage their child to stay um, calm and resilient emotionally if after every point lost they are responding in a negative emotional way. And what sort of message does it send to everybody else as well? What sort of message does it send to the opponent, to the opposing parents, to the other coaches, by acting that way? So I think remembering that they're being watched, remembering that they want to be leading by example is um, critical here. So as we start to think about some best practices, those are a couple I would start with.
One of the reasons that we wanted to emphasize the idea of parents as performers is, let's go back to some terminology that we've used in a lot of our past episodes, sort of the existential concept of life project. You can look at your tennis parenting journey as a life project, something that you yourself are trying to master. You are a performer in this context, for sure. And so the more that you are setting yourself up for success, understanding that, hey, we're going to a tournament today. I'm probably going to be emotionally challenged by certain things that happen here. How do I want to handle this? So a lot of the same themes that we've covered in this podcast for handling situations for tennis players could really be applied to this, right? So starting with the end in mind. Hey, if this is going to happen, how do I want to react to that? If my player gets a bad line call, how do I want to react to that? If my player's opponent, parent, is coaching, how do I want to react to that? There are a lot of things that could happen that you want to just not just do off the cuff, emotionally reacting in the moment. Because as you said, people are watching and your player is watching how you handle that. One thing that makes sport unfun for players is when their parents obsess and become kind of crazed in the competitive environment. When they act badly, when they are not the role model, that makes sport really not fun for kids. So we want to make sure we keep that in mind. Um, you mentioned the unconditional love and how we react to points. I think it's not only the negative reaction, it's when parents are reacting positively to one point, what points that have been won, and doing something else when points have been lost. There's that contrast. Oh, I get praise and cheering when I win. I either get nothing or something negative when I lose. So what are you doing right there? You are, helping your child be more and more judgmental about what's going on the court, which is not what we want to be teaching them. We want them to be as non-judgmental about points as possible. And if you're cheering and having negative reactions based on an outcome, that becomes very difficult if your player sees that. It's also important that when you're there, in terms of good practices, is that you're creating a community even of parents there. That there shouldn't be parent rivalries in these things. We should all be trying to help our players become better together. And I was at an ITA tournament last summer, and the parents of these two players were friendly. They knew each other. They had seen each other on the New England circuit for years, and their two kids are playing in this ITA event. And they split sets, and they're in a 10-point tiebreaker for the third. And what do you see is that the two parent couples start to separate. They stop talking to each other. They start moving away from each other, and now they're cheering their individual player. It was just really an interesting dynamic, Josh, just to see that happen where ideally, why not just cheer them both on and stay together? But um, I think our point here is that if you can be looking at yourself as a performer in this context, know how you want to handle things before the match. The challenge you brought up, Josh, is really one that parents are going to face during the match. And there are going to be challenges, especially early on. If you think about you're watching maybe your 12 and under or 10 and under player, and they forget the score. You know what the score is, but they forget the score. You can't do anything about it. Or maybe they're making, they're not seeing balls out and they're like playing out balls, and you start to get emotional about that. Or you see your players start to have a meltdown. There's so many things that you want to be prepared for that could go wrong, and that you having the understanding of what our purpose is here. You want to have a kind of a code of behavior for yourself at the tournament, knowing that a lot of stuff could happen here. But the ultimate goal is we got to keep this fun, and we want to help our player learn some good life lessons out of this, good or bad. Because I think what goes along with that unconditional love, Josh, is having a lot of empathy for what your child is going through. As we've said on this podcast, tennis is a very challenging sport. Mentally, it's very difficult. Learning to deal with the winning and losing of points, of games, of sets, of matches is not easy. And we don't want to be judging and be critical for results that are going on at the court. And even if our young player loses control emotionally, have some empathy. This is not easy to do. And I think I certainly speak from experience as far as that goes. And I'm sure you do too, with respect to that. My temper is probably way worse than yours, but I was a little emotional. And so I get it, and I think that's why I try to bring a lot of empathy to the players that I work with, because I get it. It's not easy. And I think if parents, especially those who haven't had that much experience in the sport, could be leading with that unconditional love and empathy more, it would really help their players.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think it's a probably a good place to end on because I think if there was a takeaway, I think that would probably be a really important one. Just in terms of remembering how hard it is out there, both in terms of winning a match, but also in terms of the mental and emotional side of things, as we talk so much about, in terms of maintaining emotions over the ups and downs of competition over oftentimes hours. So it's tough, and we all know when we watch sport on TV or when we watch it from the stands, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier than when you're actually out there. When you're in the heat of the moment, it can be really tough. So I agree that by approaching these situations with empathy is a great place to end, and really a great takeaway
Yeah.
as we start to wrap up this conversation.
So in terms of resources, Josh, I think you had found some stuff from Tennis Canada that was very helpful. Playerdevelopment.usta.com has a lot of material for parents, coaches, players. Um, and so I would really suggest looking at that. There's also some on the USTA.com website, some stuff about the American development model that could be very helpful to look at. And Sport Canada has a great handbook that if you just type that into Sport Canada long-term development, you'll see their PDF, which is available for free. It's about 50 pages. It's more generic to sport, but it's got a lot there in terms of how to think about the long-term development of your athletes. Josh, did you have any other resources that we should reference?
I think one last one that I would point uh, listeners to is Positive Coaching Alliance. Again, not a tennis specific resource, but just in terms of some best practices for approaching sport, for utilizing sport as a way to build character traits, to promote sportsmanship, to embody a lot of the things that we've talked about in this conversation. I think that's a great resource.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes and we'll put in some links to all of those resources. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. And you can also check out our Instagram account. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.